It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Amar Shah. So Amar and I actually go way back. We did our undergraduates together back in Cambridge. And Amar then went and worked for a couple of years for Goldman Sachs, decided he would come back to Cambridge to do a PhD, and has been setting up companies since then, so one of which has been a company called Wave. So you may have heard of this, WAYVE. So autonomous vehicles. Today they just announced they've had a partnership with Nissan, which is fantastic. I think they had the UK's biggest tech raise a few months ago, right? So SoftBank, that was 1.05 billion in funding. He's also co-founded Charm Therapeutics. So one of those co-founders last year won the Nobel Prize, and he's recently started a new venture as well with medical imaging. So on top of that, he's also an angel investor himself and has set up a fund to do larger scale investments. And fun fact, he's also going to be one of the judges for your pitching competition tomorrow. So give him a round of applause, please.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you very much for having me. My pleasure to talk to you guys and share some thoughts. The theme of what I wanted to talk about is around alignment and incentives. One of my favorite quotes by the late Charlie Munger is, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes." And hopefully you'll see what I mean once I speak about my experiences. So as Jason said, we were together as undergraduates. I studied mathematics. At the time, tech wasn't as big a thing in the UK. Most people who studied mathematics went into finance. They were the ones that were bombarding our careers events. And at the time, I was enamored by some of the people doing fancy things and getting paid very well in the city. So I did join Goldman Sachs as a quant for a couple of years, but relatively quickly felt like this wasn't for me long term. And I missed studying. I missed Cambridge. I mean, look, it looks similar to this place. You're going to miss it being in London. And emailed one of my favorite professors to say, "Do you take any students? I really want to come back and study." He said, "No, but there's this other guy that does this thing called machine learning. I think you'll like it." So I applied to one program and luckily I got it. I started that program in 2012. 2012 was the first year in which NVIDIA used a GPU to train a neural network. And you all must have heard of NVIDIA. It's one of the most successful companies in the world now. And luckily, by starting that PhD at that time, I saw this whole AI wave boom from pretty much that starting point until today. So throughout my PhD, I saw some incredible events. I was in the room when Mark Zuckerberg came to announce that Facebook were opening up an AI branch. This was in California. I saw OpenAI form, and tons of capital was going into people who had machine learning skills. So I got super lucky, right time, right place. And moderately, arrogantly, me and some friends thought, we're not going to take these fancy offers. We want to do our own thing. And so we started wondering what we could do with AI. And at the time, AI was moving very quickly, as it is today. The first big breakthroughs were actually in computer vision. So computers understanding images. That was well before all this ChatGPT type stuff has come today. So in 2015 and 16, computers being able to understand what was in an image was really a massive breakthrough. And there was a moment where some friends and I were in a conference in New York in 2016, and we read about the first fatality of a Tesla car in autopilot mode. And upon looking at why that may have happened, we found out that the car was confident about what it thought it was seeing, but incorrect. So it wasn't able to reason about its own uncertainty. And we started thinking that our PhDs were very much about reasoning about uncertainty. And why don't we apply some of our ideas to this domain? So we ended up writing a paper which did quite well. And before we knew it, we were thinking, wow, we should start a company. So we were a bunch of friends, about 7 of us to start with. Quickly, one person dropped out, so there were 6 of us. And we were thinking, what do we build here? And there was a really large company, who I won't name, who funded one of the co-founders' PhD labs, a big international company that, because they funded his research, they knew what we were doing. So they came to see us and with a lot of pleasantries, eventually offered us quite a lot of money for basically 6 guys working on projects. And we were very enamored by this. We were in our mid-20s. We were like, this big company has come to see us. We must be doing something great. And after some thinking, we realized that whilst this may look good on paper, what is really in it for them? Because for a very large company, a couple of $1 million is not that much money. And so it's almost like what a coffee would be to someone in this room. And then we realized, why would they want to do this? And what we deduced was they just wanted a base in the UK to build their own pseudo research team. So their incentives were not necessarily the same as ours. We wanted to build an independent company. And when we started telling them about this, they did change their terms slightly to look much more independent. But then we realized if we built a product and went to one of their competitors, they would potentially not want to buy it because their big competitor owns this company. So even if the terms on paper looked clean, the kind of idea that some of the competitors, or the signaling risk it's called, of other potential buyers was very high. So this created quite a bit of friction between the 6 of us. So a bunch of people thought, this is a great setup. We get lots of money to do research. We're basically like glorified postdocs. What's there to lose? And another group thought, actually, we want to remain independent and try to build a big independent company. And we don't want to take that capital and go and find other private capital, which would have been quite a long graft at that time. And so this was the first real sense of misalignment within the team. And it was a rocky process, but we did part ways because people wanted different things. Coincidentally, one of the people who wanted to do that glorified postdoc is now a professor at Oxford and is incredibly successful in his own way. And we're still friends. And it was very good that we had the hard conversation at that time, before we took any capital, to make sure we were doing things in alignment with our partners. So then essentially 2 of us remained who wanted to do the harder thing and go and find capital. And we were very aligned in what we wanted to achieve, and it was compelling. And at the time, European investors were not very optimistic about being able to compete with people like Google and Uber, who had billions of dollars. So we eventually went to the US, and there they are a bit more free with capital. They're more used to success. They're potentially open to bigger ideas. And we came across very well-known funds with lots and lots of capital. For example, $1 billion under management. And relatively quickly, some of them were willing to give us, for example, $2 million. And we were quite enamored because we were young. We had heard about these gigantic funds and how amazing the companies they had funded have become. Some we use every day, for example, some of their technologies. And we were very close to taking that capital because we thought if we have their name backing us, people will believe in us. But then again, by the same analysis, we realized for a very large fund to give us 1 or 2 million, it's not that much of their money. They don't have literal skin in the game. So they're not very aligned in the same way that you are in building a big outcome. They would only really care about us once we had become a very big company and we're moving their needle. So that's when we learned about alignment, like how much skin in the game does somebody have? Conversely, if there is an individual who is, just has an ordinary job in the UK and gets paid £50,000 and they give us £25,000 investment, it sounds small, but for them, that's a lot of their net worth. And actually, they are much more incentivized for you to grow into a big company. And so this taught us about making sure the people we align ourselves with actually have real skin in the game relative to their total capital. So this was why we chose a smaller fund who actually gave us not as good terms as the big fund, but they answered our calls every night and they were there with us when raising more capital because they knew our success was their success. So the next time we noticed this issue around alignment was in hiring people. So in most companies, when you get a job, you get a nice salary. But in a startup, a better practice is to share parts of this business with your employees, because now all the employees now have skin in the game. So if the company does well, yes, they get their salary, but by owning a piece of the company, that's how they create potentially generational wealth. So if you go to a place like Palo Alto or Mountain View in California, the house prices are very high. These are not all people who started companies. This could be employee 70 at Facebook or employee 50 at Google. Like that capital has really trickled down across all the employees. And this sharing of success is what separates us from the traditional feudal system, where only the lords would get all the money and the serfs would get nothing. So again, we learned about incentivizing our employees. Everybody who works at our companies owns a bit of the company in different proportions. And to keep them incentivized, they have this thing called vesting. So they get allocated a set of options, but they accrue every quarter or every year until their fourth year, at which point they get all those options. Then we learned when we got to years 2 or 3 of the company, some of our key employees, their options are about to vest. So what would happen if they get all their stock and then get another job? So then we realize we have to keep incentivizing them with more options. So what we do is, if someone's performing really well, we give them even more shares in the company and try to make sure everybody benefits from the success of the company. Again, improving the alignment between the employees and the founders and the company as a whole. So this principle is incredibly useful at all stages of building a company, from the very beginning, when you even decide to start a company, all the way to later down the line when you are raising capital. And whilst the company Jason mentioned, Wave, is considered a great success, and I'm very proud of it, recently they've raised $1 billion. And so think about what the person who put in $1 billion, what do they want out of this? They want this to 10x from here or more, even at the risk of it going to zero. But if you're a founder and this is your whole life, you don't want to take that bet. So at every stage in your journey building a company, you're going to be faced with this question of alignment and incentives, and make sure you partner with people who have a similar alignment to yourself, both on the vision of the company, which happened to us from the very beginning, but even with your employees and your investors, and eventually even your customers. So this deal with Nissan, whilst I probably can't say too much about details, it's very much about, are they aligned with our longer term vision of what we want to build, or are they going to pigeonhole us into doing a small service that they care about today? And these are the kinds of discussions we have had to navigate in the whole journey of the company. And at any point, if you get any one of these significantly wrong, your company can die. So managing incentives and alignment is, I think, crucial. We see it in our society today as well. Like by definition, businesses are meant to increase shareholder value. So the metric they care about is earnings per share, but that can come at the detriment of the environment, or things like pollutions or any side effects that they're not measured on. Or even what's happening in international politics today with the tariffs. We may like them or not, but the idea is to incentivize companies to build in the US and stop outsourcing outside the US. So they are just creating those incentives to get the outcomes they are looking for. So in all walks of life, you will see incentives and alignment. And I think this is the part that we got quite lucky that we had mentors and friends to help us navigate these things. But I think I see many young founders, especially in Europe, trip up on these things because we don't have as many experienced people sharing this kind of stuff. So that's kind of why I wanted to talk about incentives and alignment. And if you have a good idea, you have a lot of good people around you with the right alignment and incentives, you can do incredible things, whether it's driving a car by itself, or designing medicines with AI, or now MRI machines for $20,000. I think we're going to use the same principles in all of these ventures. So yeah, that's the main thing I wanted to talk about.
Does everyone understand what the phrase skin in the game is? Raise your hand if you do. Okay. Is there anyone that doesn't? It's okay, because it's kind of a saying. Okay. There was one. Can you explain and go in and just talk about the concept of skin in the game? Because I think that's super important. And I think a lot of people don't understand the depth of the meaning of skin in the game.
Sure. My interpretation is that everyone has an ability to benefit from the joint success of an entity, or even potentially participate in its failure if it fails. So traditionally, most people get a job and they view it as a transaction. I'll sit here from 9 to 6, I'll get paid for it, and I'll go home. And whether or not they perform very well doesn't really affect their salary that much. But if you have equity, so a share of the business, everyone who has a share in that business have the same goal. They're aligned. They want that entire business to increase in value, and they will contribute in whatever way they best can to make the entire value for everybody increase. If you just have a salary, you don't have that direct incentive to increase the value of the whole company. As long as you're getting your salary, you're happy. You don't have anything extra to lose or to gain. Okay, if you have misconduct, you could be fired, and hopefully you will be promoted. But having skin in the game means you are all driving towards one central mission of in making that business successful. And so the best way we've so far found out how to do this in entrepreneurship is to have equity. Equity is a piece of the business, if anyone doesn't know. And so if everyone has like a piece of the pie, which is skin in the game being the company and skin being the equity, you can all benefit from its success.
And if I remember correctly, you actually had some of your early stage employees requesting to reduce their salary to increase their equity. They're actually wanting to put more skin in the game because they believed in the company, right?
Right. So that was actually a very useful indicator for us. So when you're early on in the company, you really want the people around you to believe in it and not be there just for the salary, because especially early on, you have so many things you have to do, and people need to be malleable and willing to have a bit of a grind for that success. So early on, people understood that, or they really believed in the company, such that in exchange for a lower salary, they would take slightly more equity, which is a very good sign to the people running the company, because it shows this person cares about the whole success of the company more than their salary. And so when you meet people like that, it's valuable to lean in on that. And conversely, if somebody doesn't value the equity and just wants a higher salary, you're not so aligned anymore, because that means they don't believe in the value of, or the future value of, that equity. And so it's actually a useful tool to calibrate who are the people you want to partner with in that sense.
One of the things that I've seen is that misalignment between founders is a bit of a ticking time bomb, right? 1 or 2 years down the line, this can actually cause a lot of problems. And it's really useful to try and address this as early as you can, right? To make sure that you're on the same page. But that can be a very difficult conversation to have. So do you have any tips for these young budding entrepreneurs as to how to approach that conversation, sensibly and rationally, and still maintain good terms while having that conversation?
Yeah, it's a good point. It could actually be the right outcome for you to disagree and part ways. And for example, my friend who's now a professor here, that's the perfect example. So, and I think if we had continued and slowly let this misalignment tear us apart, we probably would not be friends right now. So splitting up or deciding you don't want to work together because you're misaligned is not necessarily a bad thing. If anything, it saves you a lot of time and effort. This is almost like a marriage. So you rather not get engaged and do the ceremony if there's significant misalignment, and then have a divorce later, which is really painful. It still might happen, but it's such an important relationship and such a commitment that you should take it very seriously, whether you truly are aiming in the right direction and want to go about it in a similar way. That's far more important than keeping up an appearance of cohesion just for the sake of investors or anyone else. And so you have so much to lose by not having that conversation that it's very much worth having it as early as possible. And if you can't come to a decision, having strategic ways to go about a process by which you can come to a decision in a finite time. Maybe it's a cool-off period or a short separation and getting more information from other people, but you have to commit to a deadline for deciding whether you're going to proceed or not. I think that's how we did it anyway, and I think it worked out quite well.
Awesome. And just going back to the early stages of founding the company, I kind of remember you had almost 2 MVPs, right? There was the second MVP was the one you were showing investors, but the one before that, I think, is quite an interesting story with the GTA, right?
Oh, okay.
So I think maybe as like an example of MVPs for these guys, it would be interesting to talk
Yeah.
about creating that and also what it showed or why that was important.
Right. So the way we began was that our PhDs were focused on the computer vision part, so understanding what images see. Alex and I had worked on drones with cameras on them in our summers before starting this. But before that, we didn't have much more experience with robots or cars, operating cars. So initially, we were thinking of just creating a computer vision module to sell to car companies to plug into their cars, which was a cuter, simpler, cheaper idea to build. But actually, we realized that the car companies would probably not know how to integrate this. This was very new technology at the time, and they're very slow. And after some time, we thought, actually, let's try and build the whole system. So we take the image analysis and plug that into a car and let it drive. Of course, when you have just 2 people and laptops, it's hard to prove you can do this to an investor. You don't have access to a car. We don't have people who know electronics or mechanical engineers or anything like that. So what we did as a proof of concept is we hacked Grand Theft Auto 5, and we played Grand Theft Auto 5 with another computer, and that computer just saw the screen just as we would as we play, and it managed a controller of acceleration and steering. And we showed with relatively little time that we could follow lanes and do basic driving tasks in the game. And then we had to paint a picture of how this would work in a real car and how actually it's not that different from the AI perspective. Part of the reason we went for the bigger idea wasn't just the problem of selling into car companies. We realized that because we were in such a hot field where there was so much demand for talent, we were not going to be out of a job even if our company failed. Like there was a very nice safety net because there was just so much demand for this talent. So we thought we should shoot for the moon. You should try the biggest thing we can think of because it's potentially a once in a lifetime opportunity. So this was like if we went for the end-to-end algorithm all the way from the camera action to the driving command, yeah, this is potentially a $1 trillion business if it works all over the world. It's a really massive market. And so we thought, let's shoot for that. And yeah, if we fail, we'll be fine. And that was not an obvious decision at first, but really obvious in hindsight. So you have really protected downside and massive upside. And I think when you make bets like that, you have the chance to have great outcomes. So aiming really high is really worth it when you have basic skill sets that you're confident you're going to get a job, which I imagine most people in this room are in the position. So that's how we decided that, which was challenging because many of our investors thought it was too big. And how can 2 guys from Cambridge compete with Uber and Google? And that was challenging. And we did nearly give up after a few months because we're just getting a lot of no's. But luckily, we got some yeses when we went to the US.
Is it possible that those companies that you mentioned that might have more skin in the game due to what they're giving you being a higher percentage of their network, is it possible that they could also be like more micromanaging and controlling? And if so, how do you navigate that trade-off?
It is possible. I guess you have to do your own sense check about it's a 2-way interview, right? they are giving you money, but you're giving them a part of your business. So these are things you have to evaluate. That's your responsibility as the founder. I often would actually do reference checks on them. So I'd ask people who they've previously invested in, what are they like? And so you have to determine this in your own way. But if it's not clear to them, you can be explicit and say, usually those individuals own a much smaller percentage than other people, and that you think it's fair to everyone if you give them time sort of proportionate to their investments. And if they demand a lot more and are not being helpful, then I think that's a completely valid thing to, again, be upfront about, not let it fester, just like you would with your co-founder if you had misalignment.
Thank you.
Luckily, that didn't happen to us. So.
So my question is relating to the equity that you give people as they join. So is that sometimes like a double-edged sword? If things aren't going well, for example, maybe the evaluation, if you raise again, goes down, the employees start to like turn around and say, oh, maybe this is not where I want to spend my time, if that makes sense? Because before, they have more skin in the game. So if the game's not going well, then they're like, yeah. Does that make sense?
It's possible, but I think if that were the case, then either the company should fail, and that's fine, or the whole team believes in a turnaround, and that based on a few more results or accomplishments, we can get back on track. And so that is really kind of the job of the founders to convince them if they really believe it, and if they believe the company is no longer possible because somebody else has achieved it already, then the right thing would be to fold the company. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You now have freed up your time to do something else. And I think there is a bit of a stigma around startups failing in Europe, whereas in America, people wear it as a badge of honor. If you go to San Francisco, people may introduce themselves as, the person who's failed 4 companies and on their 5th. And so I don't think folding a company is necessarily the worst thing for everybody. I think you shouldn't lie. So if the founders don't believe in it, but they're still trying to convince their investors and the staff, that's, again, this is all misalignment. So yeah, but that could be a problem. And some people may believe in it more than others, and they may choose to go to a competitor because they prefer a different approach, and that's fine.
And then kind of on top of that, if you're building a company that you're expecting to grow, how would do you save stock for people that you're expecting to hire in the future?
Yeah, so they're quite standardized ways of doing this, or principles. So usually when people raise the first main round, which is called a seed round, typically you reserve 10% of the company to incentivize new employees. Sometimes it's a bit more, sometimes less, depending on the company. And every time you raise more capital, you slightly increase that pool. And in exceptional cases, you can actually have a board resolution to increase that further for very special people. But they're relatively standardized ways of doing that. Yeah.
Thank you.
And the early employees get more than later ones, of course.
So you mentioned ESOP
Mm-hmm.
as a pool of shares for employees, and you mentioned that it should be 10% when you raised your first fund. The question is, when you raise the second one, then it should be increased to 10 or 15%. Is it this increase? It comes from your pocket or from whole investors? How does it work?
Usually, how it works is just before the new round of investment, all the existing shareholders get diluted, and then the new investor comes in, usually. So yes, there is dilution for people before the investment, usually, which includes the investors and the founders and the employees. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering, so you started out as a PhD and in machine learning, in computer vision, and then you became a CEO. So how involved are you in the research and the technical aspects when you were a CEO?
Oh,
Yeah.
that's a good question. I think for the first 6 to 9 months, quite a lot, and then gradually almost down to zero hands-on. But certainly a lot of the planning and decisions on directions to allocate resources. In this company particularly, because there's so many dimensions to it. We had a vehicle, we had mechanical engineers, we had simulation engineers who come from gaming, we had data engineers who deal with the data, we had machine learning engineers. So a lot of the role became how to allocate resources between these, and each one had their own leader. And so my role was more to liaise with them, make sure they knew what they're responsible for, and kind of stitch together the dots, but not much technical involvement. So that now my coding ability is pretty poor now, which I'm a bit sad about. But I went to 2 hackathons in the last 2 weeks, and I'm still trying just for fun. But yeah, that's one thing I have to say I personally miss. But I think I got comfortable with it because I saw the leverage of getting really smart people to work together and how much you can do. So it was a trade that I thought was worth making. And even now in Wave, I probably understand 15% of what's going on. Some things more than others. And that's very different from a PhD, where in grad school, you do everything. You think about the experiment, you do the experiment, you analyze the results, you write the paper, you go and market the paper, you're doing the whole thing. And in companies like this, you're finding other people to do each of these things, and letting go of control was, I think, quite challenging for me. And I think often why particularly PhD students might find it hard to do companies like this. And so that was probably one of the hardest things.
So is there a hard point, number of employees, amount of funding, where you had to make this conscious transition to being an allocator of resources? Yeah.
It wasn't prescribed to me by anyone or anything. I think it was a natural consequence of, I think once you get over 10 or 15 people, it's much more valuable for me to make sure these 15 people are as effective as they can be than me being as effective as I can be as an individual. Because 15 people working at their maximum is much better than me at my maximum and them at 80%. So I think, I don't know whether that was at 8 people or 15 people, but roughly around that point is when I felt much more about supporting others. It might be different in different companies.
Thank you.
How do you usually measure the success of each member in a team? Do you get first stages and upturn?
Yeah, that's very challenging. And a consequence of what I just described, I very much rely on people who are working with the sub-teams more closely and their input. But we were very concerned, or we tried to be resilient to biases with individuals. So we had a 360 review system. So people will review the closest 4 or 5 people they work with, whether they're more senior or more junior. And we tried to account for multiple perspectives, because if you just ask one person, what is the person on your team like? There could be some other issue between them that is not fair. That if I'm getting that information from one person, you can maybe make the wrong decisions. So this is actually something I learned from Goldman Sachs. I think they did that quite well. So when I was even in my first 3 months there, I was asked to review a lot of my bosses, which was a bit scary, but I think it was valuable. So that's how we do it. And then we kind of filter all that information.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lisa. So my question is, what was your failure or mistake, you think, from which you learned the most during these years of building a successful company?
I think this, what I described earlier about letting go of control and allocating tasks to delegating to other people. I think I took a little bit long for this, Um, I wouldn't say it was a failure, but I think that could have saved a lot of time and energy. And I think personally, what I found really hard, so I've been a student for so long, and even spending at the time more than £10 on a meal felt like I couldn't do that too often. Today, in today's money, that's £20. And going from that mentality to having 2 million in the bank, and then 20 million in the bank, and then 200 million in the bank, it was very hard for me to scale up my thinking about what is a large cost and what isn't. And so I think arguably early on, maybe my approach was too frugal. It's probably fine now, but yeah, just knowing how to leverage your assets was tough because my mentality couldn't keep up in a way. So not a failure, but that's something I've noticed lately.
So a follow-up question on this. So how you feel that the mindset or the mentality is important on early stage of a startup, let's say? Because what like we kind of experienced like recently, because we're building this product for some time already, is that we have a bigger vision, which recently came, and then some of like our, let's say, the people in the team who started with us early, they kind of cannot really believe in it. And like they're always trying to down like kind of going the down like road. Like is it something super important, or it's still like as long as they can help right now, like we should collaborate? Or how important is this mindset, let's say, and mentality for this?
Yeah, I think the people early in the team, it's I think much more frictionless if you all believe in the big vision being possible, whilst being pragmatic that it's going to be hard. I think if people don't believe it's possible at all, they probably aren't. They're not aligned with you. So it depends on the scale at which you're at. So I think a company that has a few hundred people that is not really in startup classifier anymore, maybe it's okay to have a few of these who are slightly skeptical. Sometimes it's healthy because you can have an opposing opinion. But early on, I think there needs to be solidarity, ideally without groupthink. I think if there's groupthink, yeah, that's dangerous. So my first employee, which wasn't the plan, actually had a degree in dance and had a very different background to us. And she was going to be a recruiter for us. But in hindsight, that was such a great decision because she was smart in her own way, in a not book smart academic way. And the opinions she offered were really had plurality of thought on the table. So people talk about diversity a lot these days, and I think they mistake it for race, gender, and things like that. But actually, you want plurality of thought, people who've grown up in different domains or had different trainings, sharing their input about how a decision should be made, and then listening to everyone, and then deciding what to do. That was really beneficial for us. Yeah, and so sometimes healthy disagreement there actually really improved. I think I learned a lot from this person because they just thought so differently to me. And I think if you're in the right company, then that people who appreciate that, I think then you'll all do quite well in your own improvement as well of how to think more unilaterally.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh yes.
Thanks for your talk. It was really nice to listen to you. My question is, if you're going from being a student or a researcher all your life and want to go into entrepreneurship without doing a job, what are the things that you're missing on? And is it really necessary to do a job in between?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I did a job for 2 years. I'm very glad I did it, but I'm even more glad I left. It definitely gave me just a sense of what it's like to work in a big organization and how some operations are done. For example, this 360 review I mentioned, I think that was very helpful to learn about. So I don't think you're necessarily losing out and that it's impossible, but I think having an awareness that some of these institutions, like the one I was at, has been around for over 100 years. So they must be doing something right, and they have principles from which we can learn. So I think participating in such an institution can show you which methods are prevailing, have had the test of time. At the same time, if you spend too long in such an institution, they could be ingrained in their train of thought, and you could become indoctrinated into a train of thought and lose your freedom. And so I think there's a balance. So I think I wouldn't say it's impossible to do a startup without that experience. I think it might be optimal to have some experience in a job, but then if you have too much, you could lose your creativity of thinking differently. So I think it's possible, and some people. My co-founder, I think this is the only job he's had. So yeah, and he's now running the company and doing pretty well at it.
All right. This has been great. I think we should thank Amar one more time for his time.
Thank you.